Okay, class, let me apologize first of all for the last video, renal video 11. I cut it off somewhat abruptly, primarily due to technical difficulties, but at least you were able to talk about the collecting duct. At least we were able to do that. So now, this particular one is on the juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is named that because juxta means next to, is positioned next to the glomerulus. It is composed of two structures, the juxtaglomerular cells of the afferent arteriole, and sometimes it's in the efferent, sometimes some have both, in contact with the macula densa. So right here, what you see is, this is the afferent arteriole. Smooth muscle cells called granular cells, or smooth muscle cells. A granule, remember, is a stained vesicle. So they have granules in them. These cells secrete renin, what we talked about in the blood vessel chapter. Okay. Then you have the macula densa, right here, which are packed, dense, slightly taller cuboidal epithelial cells. And they produce something called a vasoconstrictor substance that we'll talk about in a moment. So that's it right there. Now let's go to a picture to show you how this works. Not how it works, but the location. You see, here's the proximal convoluted tubule, and here's the loop of Henle. Now I come back here. This is the distal convoluted tubule, but you see how a portion of it touches the afferent and efferent arterioles, which is also next to the glomerulus, juxtaglomerular. So in this, the distal convoluted tubule would be that macula densa, and over here in the afferent arteriole would be the juxtaglomerular cells, also called the granular cells. Okay, so that's how the construct would be. And this again shows you on a blow-up picture that macula densa and this here. All right, let's go a little further here. So now we break down the juxtaglomerular cells. What do they do? What do they do? So I'm going to come down here also and pick out something here. Just a moment. All right. Which is going to fall under what we call tubuloglomerular feedback that I'll explain. Tubuloglomerular feedback. And we'll look at that. Okay. Now, let me kind of explain this particular aspect before we start this. Okay. We talked about the glomerular filtration rate. We said the glomerular filtration rate was approximately 125 milliliters a minute. Okay, we said the glomerular filtration rate was that. All right. We said that in order to have that rate, let's see if I can find that, you needed a mean arterial pressure, if I can find this. See, where were we? Okay, you needed a mean arterial pressure of a certain degree. And that was, let me go back here if I can find that for you. See if I can find that mean arterial pressure aspect. We needed a mean arterial pressure of around 55. Here we are. So we need a mean arterial pressure of around 55 in order to get a net field pressure of 10. Here we are now. Let's look back. So what we needed is that a net filtration pressure of 10, but in the glomerulus we had a high opposing value, which was 30 plus 15. So we need about a 55 to get a 10, whereas in the other capillaries we only need a 35 because it was not as much of an opposing force. The reason you recall we could tolerate that is because the podocytes held tight to the what? To the capillaries and wouldn't allow them to blow out. So we need about that. Okay, now let's think about this. Go back to your cardiovascular. If we came out of the heart with a mean arterial pressure of 100, then through the various resistances until we got to the afferent arteriole, we would finally be at a 55. But think about it. If for some reason we came in at less than 100, let's say an 80 or 70, hypotension, almost getting low enough to be shock at 60. If we came in at too low of a pressure, we wouldn't have enough to overcome the opposing forces. Thus, the kidney would get no blood in the glomeruli. They would dry out and you would lose your kidney. On the other hand, if you came in with too high of a blood pressure, see, think about it, hypertension, one of the things hypertension does, long-term hypertension, is destroy the kidneys. Because if you come in with too high of a pressure, you would be going too high in there and blow out, even with the podocytes holding on and everything. So you need to keep the blood pressure at a normal range. But the kidneys themselves have some intrinsic mechanisms. Remember, we talked about local control in the blood vessel chapter. They have some intrinsic mechanisms to try to maintain a normal GFR despite fluctuations in the overall blood pressure. So that's where we get into this. Let me go back down. These controls. We get into these controls here. Let me find it again. We get into these controls right there. And those controls, let's see where we are. Regulation of GFR, we have these controls. These controls can be hormonal or whatever. But now we want to talk about the controls based upon the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So that's where we are. So kind of think about this. Okay. So that would be one of our intrinsic controls within the kidney itself. Okay. So what we're looking at then, let's go down here real quick. The juxtaglomerular apparatus, let me find it here real quickly. Okay. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is made up of two cells. The juxtaglomerular cells that we said were in the walls of the afferent arteriole in most people, some the efferent, some both. But anyway, getting to the juxtaglomerular cells in there, they secrete renin. That renin we've been talking about, that's where it's secreted by the juxtaglomerular cells. The juxtaglomerular cells are modified smooth muscle cells. They evaluate their stretch. The smooth muscle evaluates their stretch. If too much stretch, they assume too high of a blood pressure. Thus, they reduce renin secretion. That decreases the production of angiotensin II. Go back and study your cardiovascular. So the blood pressure drops. If too little stretch, they assume the blood pressure is too low, and the opposite occurs. So you see, the juxtaglomerular cells are mechanoreceptors. The juxtaglomerular cells are mechanoreceptors. Let me go back here. The juxtaglomerular cells are mechanoreceptors. They're looking at stretch. All right. The macula densa, let's go, which is in the distal convoluted tubule. Let's go to that. The macula densa, which is called a dense spot. Macula in Latin means spot, and this is dense spot, are modified epithelial cells. Modified epithelial cells right there, located in the wall of the distal convoluted tubule. It can secrete a vasoconstrictor substance. Some believe that to be ATP. That's still controversial. Okay, now this is how it works. As fluid travels down from the proximal convoluted tubule to the loop of Henle to finally the distal convoluted tubule, much should have been the word here. Let me change that real quickly there. Much has been done to the initial filtrate. The initial filtrate started in the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Lots of reabsorption and secretion has occurred because you had the proximal convoluted tubule to do more and some in the loop of Henle. So by the time the filtrate has reached the DCT, its electrolyte amounts and osmotic pressure should be well reduced. Because once you remove solute, the osmotic pressure should come down. Now, the macula densa, as we said, is looking at osmotic pressure and electrolyte amounts, electrolyte concentration. So if the osmotic pressure is too high or if there's still too much salt in the fluid, the vasoconstrictor substance is secreted to vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole, which will reduce the rate of filtration. Because see, if you reduce the diameter of the afferent arteriole, you have less going into the glomerulus. Now think about it. Even though I didn't write it here, if the osmotic pressure is too low, or if there's too little salt, then what does that mean? You're going in too slow, which means then the vasoconstrictor substance should back off in order to vasodilate that area more. See what I'm saying? So this apparatus right here is real important with that. But as far as controlling the kidney GFR. But since, let's go further, you're producing renin, go back to the earlier stuff, and renin affects aldosterone, blood pressure, all kind of stuff through the angiotensin II. Then not only does it affect the kidney work, it also affects all over the body. So that's why, and let's go back, that if you go back and you study the blood vessel again, I said if a patient had renal artery stenosis, which means slight closure of the renal artery, and remember it's the end artery, only one, then the pressure going to the kidneys would be low. If the pressure going to the kidneys is low, then the pressure in the afferent arteriole would be low. So the afferent arteriole then would assume the pressure all over the body is low. Then it would kick up the production of renin, which would then increase blood pressure all over the body, even though the body already has a normal pressure, thus leading to hypertension. So now that completes the story now that you have the kidney part in there, looking at the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So I hope that you will study on this. You see I'm saying? If the GFR is too high, needed substances cannot be reabsorbed quickly enough. Remember, one needed substance was glucose. What did I say? In glucose-urea, hey, let's think about that. When I did glucose-urea, what did I say? When I did glucose-urea, where's glucose-urea? Let's look back up here. I said one of the reasons, very high blood sugar or too fast of a flow in the tubules, too high of a GFR. So you wouldn't have time to reabsorb, and not just glucose, I'm just speaking of glucose, but the other stuff too. Then if the GFR is too low, you reabsorb too much. Plus if the GFR is too low, more than likely your pressure is too low, and there it is. Now, going a little step further real quickly here, and go to something else. Under normal conditions, renal artery maintains a nearly constant glomerular filtration rate. This system can work effectively as long as MAP is between 80 and 180. That's overall coming out of the heart. During very low MAP, like in hemorrhage, it cannot work properly and must be overtaken by extrinsic controls. Extrinsic controls is going to be hormones and the nervous system. We'll talk about hormones and the nervous system. So really this particular video is primarily on just looking at the functions and anatomy of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Thank you.